Jack was having one of those days, the kind where the universe seems determined to remind you that your life is a sitcom, and you're the punchline. As a highway patrol officer, he'd spent the last 8 hours wrangling speed demons, dodging paperwork, and trying not to lose his sanity over yet another driver claiming, "I didn't see the speed limit sign." By the time he pulled into his driveway, all Jack wanted was to park his patrol car, kick off his boots, and collapse onto his couch. But fate, or rather Karen from the HOA, had other plans. Karen was standing there, clipboard in hand, with the kind of smug expression that could make even Gandhi contemplate violence. She was the self-appointed sheriff of the neighborhood HOA, a role she took as seriously as an Oscar contender preparing for a biopic. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was living them. Her uniform consisted of pastel cardigans and khaki pants that screamed suburban authority, and her weapon of choice was passive-aggressive notes left on mailboxes. Jack barely had time to turn off his engine before Karen descended upon him like a hawk spotting prey. "Officer Jack," she began, emphasizing his title with a tone that suggested it was both beneath her and entirely irrelevant. "Do you know you're in violation of HOA parking regulations?" Jack blinked at her, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Karen, it's my patrol car. I just got off work." Karen's eyes narrowed as if Jack had just confessed to smuggling exotic animals. "It doesn't matter. The HOA rules clearly state that vehicles must be parked inside garages or designated spaces. Patrol cars are not exempt." Jack stared at her for a moment, trying to process the absurdity of what he was hearing. "Karen, this is a government vehicle. It's not like I'm parking an ice cream truck out here." Karen wasn't fazed. She flipped through her clipboard with the precision of someone who had memorized every line of the HOA covenants, conditions and restrictions, CC and RS, and probably slept with them under her pillow. Section 14B explicitly states that no vehicles, commercial or otherwise, may remain parked outside for more than 2 hours unless approved by the board. She recited with the enthusiasm of a spelling bee champion nailing anti-disestablishmentarianism. "And I don't recall seeing any approval for your patrol car." Jack rubbed his temples. "Karen, do you understand how ridiculous this sounds? I'm literally here to protect people like you from actual criminals." Karen sniffed. "Well, I don't see any criminals around here, except maybe rule violators." Jack opened his mouth to retort but stopped himself. He knew better than to argue with Karen. She was the kind of person who could turn a debate about lawn gnomes into a Supreme Court case. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "What's the penalty?" Karen's face lit up like she'd just won bingo night at the community center. "A $100 fine," she said cheerfully, handing him a ticket printed on paper so pristine it might have been ironed. Jack took the ticket without another word and walked inside, leaving Karen standing triumphantly in his driveway as if she'd just apprehended Al Capone. Inside his house, Jack dropped onto the couch and stared at the fine in disbelief. $100 for parking his patrol car? Was this real life? He felt like he'd stepped into some Kafkaesque nightmare where bureaucracy had evolved into its final form. Suburban tyranny. He considered paying the fine just to make Karen go away, but quickly dismissed the idea. This wasn't about $100, it was about principle. Jack had spent years enforcing laws designed to keep people safe. He wasn't about to let some HOA dictator bully him over parking regulations. Determined to fight back, Jack pulled out his laptop and started researching HOA rules. He found himself diving into a rabbit hole of legal jargon so dense it made traffic law look like kindergarten math. The CC and RS were filled with pages upon pages of rules governing everything from mailbox colors to acceptable holiday decorations. It was like reading Orwell's 1984, but instead of Big Brother watching you, it was Karen, and she had binoculars. After an hour of digging, Jack found what he was looking for. A clause stating that HOA rules couldn't override federal or state laws regarding emergency vehicles. His patrol car wasn't just any vehicle. It was government property designed for public safety, a fact that should exempt it from Karen's petty regulations. Armed with this newfound knowledge, Jack decided to confront Karen at the next HOA meeting. He imagined walking in like Atticus Finch delivering his closing argument in To Kill a Mockingbird, except instead of racial injustice, he'd be fighting against HOA tyranny. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige building that smelled faintly of mildew and bad coffee. Karen sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over her court, flanked by other board members who seemed more interested in their phones than neighborhood governance. When Jack walked in, all eyes turned to him. Karen's smile faltered for a moment before she recovered her composure. "Officer Jack," she said sweetly, though her tone dripped with condescension. "What brings you here?" Jack held up the fine like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. "I'm here because this," he waved the ticket, "is nonsense." Karen raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I've reviewed your CC and RS," Jack continued, "and according to Section 22C under exemptions, emergency vehicles are not subject to parking restrictions." Karen's smile froze on her face as murmurs rippled through the room. "I drive a patrol car," Jack said firmly. "It's an emergency vehicle used for public safety, which means your fine is invalid." Karen opened her mouth to respond but seemed momentarily speechless, a rare occurrence for someone whose favorite pastime was lecturing people about hedge heights. "Well," she finally said, recovering her composure, "perhaps we can discuss this further after reviewing." "No need," Jack interrupted. He pulled out printed copies of both the CC and RS and state law regarding emergency vehicles and handed them to each board member. "It's all right here." The room fell silent as the board members skimmed through the documents. Karen looked increasingly uncomfortable as it became clear that Jack had outmaneuvered her. After what felt like an eternity, one board member cleared his throat and said, "It seems Officer Jack is correct." Karen's face turned redder than a stop sign. As Jack left the meeting that night, he couldn't help but feel victorious. Not just because he'd won, but because he'd stood up against absurdity disguised as authority. Back home, he parked his patrol car in its usual spot and smiled when he saw Karen peeking through her blinds from across the street. For once, she didn't march over with her clipboard. Instead, she retreated into her house like a vampire avoiding sunlight. Jack leaned back against his car and chuckled to himself. In a world full of chaos and absurdity, sometimes all you needed was a little revenge, and maybe some good old-fashioned common sense. Jack's morning started with the kind of optimism only a fool, or someone who hadn't yet encountered Karen, could muster. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down at his kitchen table, and opened his laptop. Today was the day he'd dive into the HOA's governing documents, a collection of rules so convoluted they made tax law look like a children's coloring book. If Karen wanted to play lawyer, Jack was ready to meet her on the battlefield of bureaucracy. The HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or CC and RS, as the HOA cultists called them, were a 72-page monstrosity of legalese that dictated everything from acceptable mailbox designs to the precise shade of beige your house could be painted. Jack had once thought he understood the concept of community standards, but this document made it clear. Living here was less about community and more about surviving Karen's reign of terror. The first few pages were harmless enough, basic stuff about dues and meeting schedules. But by page 10, Jack found himself in a Kafkaesque maze of restrictions. No vehicle may remain parked in a driveway for more than 2 hours unless explicitly approved by the board. He read aloud, his voice dripping with disbelief. Explicitly approved? What are we, applying for visas to park our own cars? He flipped to another section. Trash bins must be placed at the curb no earlier than 6 a.m. on collection day and removed no later than 6:01 p.m. Jack snorted into his coffee. God forbid someone sees a trash bin after sunset. The horror. But then he hit pay dirt. Buried deep in Section 22C was a clause exempting emergency vehicles from parking restrictions. It was written in the kind of small print you'd need a magnifying glass to read. But it was there. Emergency vehicles, including but not limited to police cars, fire trucks, and ambulances, are exempt from all parking regulations outlined herein. Jack leaned back in his chair with a triumphant grin. Gotcha! Armed with this nugget of legal gold, Jack decided to confront Karen directly. He wasn't naive enough to think she'd admit defeat easily. Karen didn't just enforce rules. She was the rules. But he figured even she couldn't argue with her own sacred text. Later that afternoon, Jack spotted Karen patrolling the neighborhood like some sort of suburban hall monitor. Clipboard in hand, she was inspecting lawns for infractions that probably only existed in her imagination. Jack approached her with all the confidence of a man holding incontrovertible evidence. "Karen," he called out, waving a printed copy of the CC and RS like it was the Declaration of Independence. She turned to face him, her expression a mix of annoyance and curiosity. "Officer Jack," she replied. Her tone as frosty as an unheated HOA clubhouse in January. "What can I do for you?" Jack held up the document. "I've been reading through our HOA rules. Fascinating stuff, by the way. And I came across something interesting." He flipped to Section 22C and pointed at the exemption clause. "According to this, my patrol car is classified as an emergency vehicle and is therefore exempt from your parking restrictions." Karen squinted at the page as if trying to will it into saying something else. "Well," she said after a moment, "that clause applies to active emergency vehicles." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Active? It's not like I turn into a pumpkin when I'm off duty. My car is still equipped for emergencies 24/7. Karen crossed her arms, clearly grasping at straws now. "Even so, I don't recall you submitting any paperwork for approval." "Approval?" Jack laughed incredulously. "It's an exemption, Karen. That means I don't need approval." Karen's face flushed red. A rare sight for someone who usually radiated icy authority. "I'll have to consult with the board about this," she said stiffly. "Great," Jack said with a grin that could rival any smug HOA president's. "Let me know what they say." The next day, Jack received an email from Karen summoning him to an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for that evening. The subject line read, "Urgent discussion of parking violations." Jack chuckled as he imagined Karen frantically rallying her minions for what she probably considered a life-or-death situation. When he arrived at the meeting, he found Karen seated at the head of a long table flanked by other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, perhaps even enduring jury duty or root canals. "Thank you for coming," Karen began in her best imitation of professionalism. "We're here to address Officer Jack's recent parking violations and his interpretation of Section 22C. Jack leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "It's not my interpretation. It's what it says." Karen ignored him and turned to one of the board members, a man named Ted who seemed perpetually confused by his own existence. "Ted," she said sharply, "you've reviewed this clause, haven't you?" Ted cleared his throat nervously and adjusted his glasses. Yes, I did. And it does seem to say that emergency vehicles are exempt." Karen shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "But," Ted added hastily, clearly fearing for his life, "we could argue that exemptions should only apply during emergencies." Jack rolled his eyes so hard he nearly sprained something. "Ted," he said patiently, "do you honestly think I'm going to move my patrol car every 2 hours just because Karen doesn't like looking at it?" Ted mumbled something incoherent and avoided eye contact. Karen seized the opportunity to regain control of the conversation. "The fact remains," she said crisply, "that allowing exceptions sets a dangerous precedent." "A dangerous precedent?" Jack repeated incredulously. "What are you afraid of? Fire trucks taking over our driveways? Ambulances throwing wild parties?" A few chuckles rippled through the room. A minor victory, but one Jack savored nonetheless. Karen's lips thinned into a straight line as she realized she was losing ground. Desperate times called for desperate measures, or at least desperate interpretations of HOA bylaws. "Well," she said finally, her voice dripping with faux magnanimity, "perhaps we can vote on whether Officer Jack's vehicle qualifies for exemption." Jack smirked. This was exactly what he'd been waiting for. The vote didn't go as Karen had hoped. Despite her best efforts to sway the board with dire warnings about slippery slopes and neighborhood chaos, most members sided with Jack, partly because they agreed with him and partly because they were tired of Karen dragging them into petty disputes. As the meeting adjourned, Karen stormed out without so much as a goodbye, a rare defeat for someone who usually ruled with an iron fist or clipboard. Jack walked home feeling victorious but also slightly bemused by how much effort had gone into something so trivial. Still, there was something deeply satisfying about beating Karen at her own game, and knowing that his patrol car would remain parked exactly where it belonged. For now, anyway, Jack thought the HOA drama was finally behind him. He had won the vote, his patrol car was officially exempt, and Karen had stormed off into the night like a defeated supervillain. But Jack underestimated one thing: Karen's ability to hold a grudge. If petty vindictiveness were an Olympic sport, Karen would have more gold medals than Michael Phelps. It started small, almost imperceptible at first. Jack noticed his mailbox was slightly askew one morning, as if someone had nudged it just enough to annoy him but not enough to warrant a repair. Then came the trash can incident. Jack woke up to find his bin mysteriously tipped over, its contents scattered across his driveway like some avant-garde art installation. He suspected Karen immediately, but without proof, he couldn't confront her. Besides, he figured she'd eventually tire herself out. Surely even Karen had limits. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, Jack received another fine in the mail, this time for unauthorized landscaping. According to the HOA, his front lawn was not in compliance with community standards. Jack stared at the ticket in disbelief. His lawn was immaculate. He mowed it every Saturday like clockwork. If anything, it was the most compliant lawn in the entire neighborhood. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in revenge. Jack marched over to the HOA office to contest the fine, only to be met with Karen's signature smirk and a stack of photos she'd taken of his yard from various unflattering angles. "See," she said, pointing to a picture where a single dandelion poked through the grass like an unwelcome guest at a dinner party. "This is clearly a violation." Jack stared at her, dumbfounded. "Karen, it's one dandelion." Karen shrugged. "Rules are rules." Jack clenched his jaw and walked out before he said something that would get him arrested. This wasn't about landscaping. It was about power. Karen had lost the parking battle, and now she was waging war on his lawn. Over the next few weeks, the fines kept coming, one for excessive noise. His dog barked twice during a thunderstorm. Another for improper holiday decorations. He'd left up his 4th of July flag for an extra day. And yet another for failure to maintain property aesthetics. Apparently his recycling bin wasn't perfectly aligned with his trash bin. Each fine was more ridiculous than the last. But Jack knew better than to pay them. This wasn't justice, it was Karen's vendetta disguised as bureaucracy. Jack decided it was time to fight back. Not with words or votes, but with strategy. He spent hours researching HOA bylaws, looking for loopholes and inconsistencies he could exploit. What he found was shocking. Karen had been bending and outright breaking the rules for years. She'd issued fines without proper board approval, ignored due process requirements, and even used HOA funds for personal expenses, including a suspiciously high bill for office supplies that seemed to coincide with her new patio furniture. Armed with this information, Jack devised a plan so diabolical it would make Karen regret ever crossing him. Step 1 was gathering allies. Jack started talking to other residents who'd been victimized by Karen's reign of terror. It turned out he wasn't alone. Nearly everyone in the neighborhood had their own horror story about Karen's tyranny. There was Linda, who'd been fined $50 for leaving her car window cracked during a rainstorm, unsightly appearance. And Bob, who'd received a warning letter because his garden gnome didn't meet HOA 8 requirements, must not exceed 12 inches. Even Ted, the perpetually confused board member, admitted he'd once been reprimanded for using non-regulation Christmas lights. Together, they formed what Jack jokingly called the Anti-Karen Coalition. Their mission: expose Karen's corruption and reclaim their neighborhood from her iron grip. Step 2 was collecting evidence. Jack and his coalition began documenting every instance of Karen's rule-breaking behavior, from her unauthorized fines to her misuse of HOA funds. They combed through meeting minutes, reviewed financial records, and even interviewed former board members who'd resigned in frustration over Karen's antics. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from Linda, who discovered that Karen had been using HOA resources to pay for private landscaping services at her own house. A clear violation of both ethics and bylaws. Jack couldn't believe his luck. This was the smoking gun he needed. Step 3 was execution, or rather, exposure. Jack organized a special community meeting under the guise of discussing neighborhood improvements. He knew Karen wouldn't miss an opportunity to assert her dominance in front of an audience. When the day arrived, the clubhouse was packed with residents eager to hear what Jack had planned. Karen sat at her usual spot at the head of the table, clipboard in hand and smugness dialed up to 11. "Thank you all for coming," she began in her usual condescending tone. "I hope we can have a productive discussion about how we can continue improving our wonderful community." Jack stood up before she could launch into one of her trademark monologues. "Actually," he said, holding up a stack of papers, "I'd like to discuss some concerns regarding our HOA leadership." Karen's smile faltered slightly but quickly recovered. "Of course," she said sweetly. "I'm always open to feedback." Jack wasted no time diving into the evidence, starting with Karen's unauthorized fines and ending with her misuse of funds for personal gain. As he presented each piece of evidence, gasps rippled through the room like waves crashing against a shore. Karen tried to interrupt multiple times but was quickly shut down by other residents demanding answers. "Is this true?" Linda asked angrily, holding up a photo of Karen's professionally landscaped backyard. Karen stammered something about miscommunication, but it was clear she'd been caught red-handed. By the time Jack finished his presentation, Karen looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear forever. The fallout was swift and brutal in true HOA fashion. The board voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position effective immediately. Residents cheered as she stormed out of the clubhouse without so much as a goodbye. Jack couldn't help but feel victorious. Not just because he'd won, but because he'd stood up for everyone who'd been bullied by Karen over the years. As he walked home that night, he passed by Ted's house and noticed something remarkable. Ted had put up Christmas lights, non-regulation ones, and they looked beautiful. For once, it felt like justice had prevailed in their little corner of suburbia. And as Jack parked his patrol car in his driveway without fear of retribution, he couldn't help but smile. Karen might have ruled with an iron clipboard, but Jack had proven that even tyrants could be toppled when people stood together. Jack thought the HOA saga had reached its natural conclusion. Karen had been dethroned. The neighborhood had collectively celebrated her downfall, and Ted's non-regulation Christmas lights were twinkling proudly like tiny beacons of suburban rebellion. But Jack underestimated one thing: Karen's ability to rise from the ashes of humiliation like a phoenix fueled by spite. If there was one universal truth about Karen, it was this: she didn't know when to quit. It started with whispers. Ted mentioned seeing Karen walking around the neighborhood at odd hours, clipboard-less but suspiciously observant. Linda reported receiving a passive-aggressive email from an anonymous sender about her garden gnome's questionable placement. Even Bob, who was usually oblivious to everything except football and his barbecue grill, noticed Karen lurking near his mailbox one morning. Jack wasn't surprised when the HOA received a formal complaint from Karen, signed with her full name and a flourish that practically screamed, "I'm still relevant." The complaint accused Jack of disrupting community harmony and inciting anti-HOA sentiment. She even included a list of grievances against him, ranging from his excessively loud lawnmower to the fact that his patrol car was an eyesore. Jack couldn't help but laugh when he read it. Karen might have lost her official title, but she hadn't lost her knack for weaponizing petty grievances. It was almost impressive, but Jack wasn't about to let Karen drag him back into another round of HOA nonsense. He decided it was time to end this feud once and for all, not with another meeting or vote, but with something more creative. If Karen wanted war, Jack would give her war, but on his terms. Step 1 was reconnaissance. Jack spent an entire weekend observing Karen's movements, which were surprisingly predictable. She followed the same routine every day: morning walk around the neighborhood, presumably to catalog infractions, mid-afternoon coffee run, always at the same cafe, and evening stroll past her favorite houses, likely to admire lawns that met her impossibly high standards. Step 2 was planning. Jack enlisted the help of Linda, Bob, and Ted, the core members of the Anti-Karen Coalition, to execute his plan. Each person had a specific role to play, and Jack made sure they understood the stakes. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about sending a message. Karen didn't run this neighborhood anymore. The plan began on a sunny Tuesday morning when Karen left for her usual walk. Jack had strategically placed signs along her route, signs that looked official but were anything but. The first sign read, HOA Rule Update. All sidewalks must be cleared of debris by 8 a.m. The second sign added, violations will result in immediate fines. By the time Karen reached the third sign, which declared, unauthorized walking prohibited beyond this point, she looked visibly confused. Linda, who had been hiding behind a hedge with binoculars, reported that Karen spent several minutes inspecting each sign before furiously snapping photos with her phone. It was exactly what Jack had hoped for. Karen couldn't resist enforcing rules, even fake ones. The next phase of the plan involved Bob's barbecue grill, a tool of chaos disguised as backyard leisure equipment. Bob fired up the grill and began cooking an absurd amount of meat, creating a cloud of smoke so thick it could have been mistaken for a forest fire. The smell wafted through the neighborhood, drawing Karen out of her house like a moth to a flame. "Bob!" she shouted as she approached his yard, clipboard magically reappearing in her hand. "This is a clear violation of HOA air quality standards." Bob feigned ignorance, flipping burgers with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Air quality standards? Never heard of them." Karen pointed at the smoke billowing from his grill. "You're polluting the neighborhood." Bob shrugged. "I'm just making dinner." Karen stormed off in frustration, muttering something about filing an official complaint. Meanwhile, Ted, bless his perpetually confused heart, was executing his part of the plan with surprising competence. He'd set up an elaborate Christmas light display in his front yard that violated every HOA rule imaginable. Blinking lights, mismatched colors, and even an inflatable Santa Claus riding a motorcycle. It was glorious chaos. When Karen arrived to inspect Ted's yard, she looked like she might faint from sheer indignation. "Ted!" she exclaimed, clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline. "This is unacceptable." Ted scratched his head innocently. "What's wrong with it?" Karen gestured wildly at the display. "Everything. The blinking lights. The inflatable Santa. It's against HOA regulations." Ted tilted his head as if he were genuinely confused. "But I thought we weren't under your regulations anymore." Karen sputtered incoherently before retreating in defeat. The final phase of Jack's plan involved himself and his patrol car, which had become Karen's nemesis since day one. He parked it in front of her house, not blocking her driveway or breaking any rules, just sitting there like an immovable monument to everything she hated. Karen emerged from her house within minutes, glaring at the car like it had personally insulted her ancestors. "Jack!" she shouted across the street. Jack stepped out of his house casually, holding a cup of coffee like he had all the time in the world. "Morning, Karen." "What is this?" she demanded, pointing at the car. "It's my patrol car," Jack said calmly. "You can't park it here," she snapped. "Actually," Jack replied with a smirk, "I can." Karen looked like she might explode on the spot, but before she could say anything else, Linda appeared behind her holding one of Jack's fake signs. "Karen," Linda said sweetly, "did you see this new rule update? Unauthorized yelling is prohibited beyond this point." Karen turned to glare at Linda before storming back into her house without another word. By the end of the day, Karen had retreated into complete silence, a rare and beautiful sight for everyone involved. The Anti-Karen Coalition celebrated their victory with drinks at Bob's house, and more barbecue smoke just for good measure. Jack couldn't help but feel proud. Not just because they'd outsmarted Karen, but because they'd done it together as a community. For once, it felt like they were reclaiming their neighborhood from tyranny, and having fun while doing it. As he parked his patrol car back in front of his own house that night, Jack smiled to himself. Sometimes revenge wasn't just sweet, it was downright hilarious. Jack woke up the next morning feeling victorious. The Anti-Karen Coalition had pulled off their most elaborate operation yet, and Karen had been silenced, at least for now. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful. Ted's Christmas lights were still blinking proudly, Bob's barbecue grill was still smoking like a chimney, and Karen's blinds remained conspicuously shut. It was as if the entire community had collectively exhaled. But Jack knew better than to let his guard down completely. Karen might have retreated, but she wasn't the type to admit defeat. She was probably inside her house right now, plotting her next move with the intensity of a Bond villain stroking a cat. Jack decided to enjoy the calm while it lasted. He stepped outside with his coffee, savoring the quiet morning air. His patrol car gleamed in the driveway, a symbol of his hard-won freedom. As he sipped his coffee, Linda walked by with her dog, a fluffy little Pomeranian named Captain Fluffington. "Morning, Jack," she said cheerfully. "How's it feel to be the neighborhood hero?" Jack chuckled. Hero might be a stretch, but it feels good to finally put Karen in her place. Linda grinned. "Well, if she tries anything else, you know we've got your back." Jack nodded appreciatively as Linda continued her walk. It was moments like this that reminded him why he'd fought so hard in the first place. This wasn't just about parking fines or lawn aesthetics. It was about standing up for the little guy, and occasionally the little dog. The day passed uneventfully, which in itself felt like a victory. Jack spent the afternoon mowing his lawn, not because Karen had ever complained about it, though she probably would have if she'd thought of it, but because he genuinely enjoyed the simple satisfaction of a freshly cut yard. As he pushed the mower back into his garage, he spotted Bob waving from across the street. "Hey, Jack," Bob called out. "We're firing up the grill again tonight. Come by if you're hungry." Jack laughed. "Thanks, Bob, but I think I've had enough smoke inhalation for 1 week." Bob shrugged good-naturedly and disappeared back into his backyard. Jack shook his head with a smile and headed inside to relax. That evening, just as Jack was settling onto his couch with a beer and a rerun of Cops, there was a knock at his door. He sighed, already suspecting who it might be. Sure enough, when he opened the door, there stood Karen, clipboard in hand and an expression that could curdle milk. "Karen," Jack said flatly, "what can I do for you?" Karen didn't waste any time on pleasantries. "I'm here to deliver this," she said, thrusting an envelope into his hand. Jack opened it and scanned the contents. It was another fine, this one for failure to maintain proper mailbox alignment. He stared at her in disbelief. "Mailbox alignment?" he repeated incredulously. Karen crossed her arms smugly. "Your mailbox is tilted approximately 3 degrees to the left." Jack blinked at her, wondering if she'd finally lost whatever tenuous grip on reality she'd been clinging to. "Karen," he said slowly, "you do realize that mailboxes aren't precision instruments, right? They're not supposed to be perfectly aligned." Karen ignored him and pointed at her clipboard. "The HOA guidelines clearly state that all mailboxes must be upright and level." Jack sighed deeply and leaned against his doorframe. "Karen, do you ever get tired of this?" "Tired of what?" she asked defensively. "This," Jack said, gesturing vaguely at her clipboard and general aura of authoritarianism. "Spending all your time nitpicking other people's lives instead of just living your own." Karen bristled at his words but didn't respond immediately. For a brief moment, Jack thought he saw something resembling doubt flicker across her face. But then it was gone. "I'm just doing my duty as a concerned resident," she said stiffly before turning on her heel and marching back down his driveway. Jack watched her go with a mixture of frustration and pity. He couldn't help but wonder what had made Karen this way. What had turned her into someone who found joy in wielding power over others through arbitrary rules and fines. But then he shook his head and dismissed the thought. Trying to psychoanalyze Karen was like trying to teach a cat algebra. Pointless and likely to end in scratches. The next morning, Jack decided it was time for one final act of defiance. A gesture so bold that even Karen would have no choice but to back down for good. He went online and ordered a custom mailbox shaped like a police car, complete with flashing LED lights and a siren that activated whenever mail was delivered. When the mailbox arrived a few days later, Jack installed it proudly at the end of his driveway. It was ridiculous and over the top in every way imaginable, which made it perfect for sending a message to Karen. "I'm not playing your game anymore." Sure enough, within minutes of its installation, Karen appeared on the sidewalk with her clipboard in hand. "Jack," she called out angrily. "What is that?" "It's my new mailbox," Jack replied innocently. That's not regulation, Karen snapped. Jack smirked. Actually, it is. He held up a copy of the HOA guidelines he'd printed out earlier that morning. There's nothing in here that says mailboxes can't have lights or sirens. Karen sputtered incoherently as she scanned the document herself, searching desperately for some rule. Any rule that would support her case. But there was none. Defeated once again, Karen stormed off without another word. Over time, Karen's influence over the neighborhood began to fade. Residents grew bolder in their defiance of her petty rules. Ted even added an inflatable reindeer to his Christmas display, and eventually, Karen stopped showing up altogether. Life in the neighborhood returned to normal, or as normal as life could be when your mailbox occasionally started blaring sirens at 7 a.m. because someone delivered junk mail too early. As for Jack, he couldn't have been happier. He'd stood up to tyranny, albeit suburban tyranny, and won not just for himself but for everyone who'd ever been bullied by someone like Karen. And while he knew there would always be another Karen lurking somewhere in the world with a clipboard and an inflated sense of authority, he also knew this. Sometimes all it takes to defeat them is a little creativity, and maybe a police car-shaped mailbox. If you enjoyed this story of suburban warfare and petty revenge, and let's be honest, you did, don't forget to like this post. Share it with your friends who've ever dealt with their own version of Karen. And hey, leave me a comment about your own HOA horror stories. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of justice served. One ridiculous rule at a time.